A very warm welcome again. We are working through a series looking at John's Gospel, and today we're up to John chapter 8. We're looking at John 8, verses 2 to 11. So let me read John chapter 8, verses 2 to 11. At dawn, he, that's Jesus, appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," declared Jesus. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Has anyone ever said to you the words, "I forgive you"? If so, I imagine you can still remember what it felt like. Years ago, I was studying, and I got the opportunity to go with a tutor from the university faculty to basically carry his bags on a trip that he was making to Albania. And once we were in Albania, he was invited to go and be interviewed on live breakfast television. It was the biggest rating show on Albanian TV. And we had to get to the studios literally at the crack of dawn. And I was standing there holding his bag and his coat when he went off to the bathroom. At which point a very nice woman said, "Oh, let me take those from you and follow me." And she led me into a room next door. We sat down on this nice sofa. She sat down next to me. We were chatting away. Another woman came and sat opposite. Now, I was so half asleep because it was so early. I didn't really register that the room was unusually dark. And then suddenly, the lights went up. And to my horror, I found myself sitting on the set of breakfast television. And then the cameras began to roll. Turns out the woman next to me on the sofa was my translator. And the woman opposite was the host. And as the translator whispered into my ear, the terror of the situation struck me. The host introduced me as the university tutor. Apparently, I'm a world expert in ethics and economics. I was thinking, what do I do? I can't just get up and run off set. What do I do? This can't get any worse. Actually, it did get worse, because she then asked me a question. I will never forget the moment she asked that question. It was this: "In your expert opinion, what do you think of the recently proposed criteria that Albania must first fulfill before negotiations can begin for her entry into the European Union?" I mean, you try answering that at 6 a.m. What could I do? In that split second, options flew through my head. Number one, pretend to faint. Number two, explain that you're the man literally just there to carry the bags. But then I thought, oh no, I'll be on one of those funny outtake shows for years to come. Or option number 3, try and answer the question. So I began to try and answer the question. About 5 seconds into what I can only describe as probably the worst answer ever given on live national television, the situation got even worse. Because who walks onto the set and sits next to me on the sofa but the university tutor, who then, through the translator, introduces himself with exactly the same name that I've just been introduced as. Thankfully, I think they just thought it was a very common name in England. Well, after 10 minutes of torture, we left the set, and of course I apologized to him. And I can't tell you how good it felt when he turned to me and said, "Don't worry, Miles, I forgive you." Now, here in John chapter 8, we see the power of real forgiveness. John's gospel is unique. John's purpose for writing is twofold. Firstly, to answer the question, who is Jesus? What theologians call Christology. And the identity and glory of Jesus is progressively revealed through the gospel in a series of miracles, beginning, as we saw a few weeks ago, John chapter 2, the wedding in Cana, and culminating at the cross and resurrection. The cross being the ultimate place where Jesus' glory is revealed in John. But there's a second purpose for writing. John wants to show that it's this very Jesus who brings you and me life. So John chapter 1, in him was life. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus says in John 10, I have come that you may have life. And John 20, John himself describes his purpose for writing. He says, these things are written in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and in believing have life. Life is a really big deal in John's gospel. And here in John 8, we see basically the whole good news of the gospel summarized in this one passage. And it shows us that forgiveness is the key to accessing this life in Christ. Now, the context is the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. The teachers of the law being like the ordained ones, and the Pharisees, the zealous laity. They've set a trap for Jesus. Verse 4, we read, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" The woman here probably was guilty. Jewish law had it that there had to be at least 2 eyewitnesses for such an accusation to be made. They say that she's been caught in the act. She doesn't deny it, and later Jesus says, go live your life of sin. So what's the trap? Well, if Jesus says, don't stone her, then they can accuse him. Calls himself a rabbi? What sort of rabbi is he? He's just a soft Roman collaborator. But if he says, okay, stone her, then he's also in trouble. Because Palestine, as you know, was under Roman occupation, and within the Roman Empire, only the Romans had the right to pronounce execution. So if he says stone her, he's a rebel and an enemy of Caesar. He's damned if he does, he's damned if he doesn't. It seems the perfect trap has been laid. But Jesus' response is really quite unexpected. Rather than answering them directly, he stoops down and he begins to write in the ground. What's that about? In the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus usually teaches through parables, stories. But in John's Gospel, He mainly preaches through dialogue with people. Yet here in chapter 8, it's not just the dialogue that's important. It's the movement in the passage. It's the choreography of the scene. And in his actions, Jesus acts out the gospel. So everyone in this scene is standing. Either, like the woman, they're standing on trial, and maybe you're here today and you might feel a bit like that. Like you're fearing being judged by others, or you're feeling guilty on trial. Or, like the accusers, they're standing in judgment with their stones raised in hypocrisy. And yet Jesus, the only one who actually has the right to stand, chooses to stoop humbly down. Are we standing or stooping? And this one movement of bending down is really an enactment of the incarnation, what we celebrate at Christmas. You see, in Philippians chapter 2, Paul puts it this way. Speaking of Jesus, it says, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but rather became nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, he humbled himself. But Jesus he doesn't leave it there. He stoops, yes, but then, verse 7, verse 10, he straightens up. Now, that word in the original Greek text for straightening up can also be translated lifted up. This is a reference to John 3 and later in John 8 when Jesus says that he must be lifted up. That phrase, lifted up, in John always refers to the cross. That's why when he's lifted up, he utters words of grace in the situation. In other words, in response to this issue of sin, whether it's the guilt of the accused or the judgmentalism of the accusers, Jesus, through his actions, is saying, this is precisely why I had to come and be born in that stable in Bethlehem. This is precisely why I will be lifted up in glory on the cross. My answer to you, accusers, is not one of words. It's one of my life. That's the answer to this problem. And we see from this remarkable forgiveness that Jesus offers three things that it impacts, three ways that it impacts our life. And the first one is this: Jesus changes attitudes in life. He changes the attitudes of the accusers. Verse 2 tells us that it's dawn when they assemble in the temple courts. It would have still been semi-dark. Light and darkness are motifs in John's gospel. And darkness always represents a lack of understanding. That's why John 3, Nicodemus comes to him at night with all of his questions. He doesn't understand a thing. Likewise, later on in the Gospel, John 20, we're told that the women go to the tomb that first Easter morning at dawn, whilst it's still dark. They didn't understand that he was risen. And here they come at dawn, whilst it's still semi-dark. The accusers, the crowd, they don't understand that in condemning the woman, they're actually condemning themselves. And what's more, we're told it's the Feast of Tabernacles, in Hebrew, Sukkot. And it's the final day, it's the 8th day of the feast, which was a Sabbath. Now, Jewish law had it that on the Sabbath, even if you wrote 2 letters, it was considered work and you were breaking the law. But they believed on the Sabbath it was okay to actually write in the dust on the ground. That wasn't breaking the law. So by doing this, Jesus is effectively saying, I'm not the lawbreaker here. I haven't come to break the law. I've come to fulfill it. And then he raises the bar and he changes their attitude by uttering one sentence. Verse 7, he says this, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." The word there for without sin is a hapax legomenon. That's quite a word, isn't it? That means it's not used anywhere else in the New Testament. It means to be without sin, not just, you might get a bit impatient with a friend. No, it means to be without sin of a similar magnitude of which the accusers are accusing the woman. And he says, I often remember this verse incorrectly. Jesus doesn't say, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." He actually says, "Let him who's without sin be the first one to cast a stone." Because the Jews believed that it had to be the witnesses who threw the stones first. So in other words, Jesus is saying to the crowd, are you really qualified to judge this woman? He says to you and to me, are you really qualified to judge that person? Of course, the irony is he's the only one who really is qualified. And the stones begin to drop. First of all, the older ones, then the younger. Now, my own personal view, and I must stress this is conjecture, we don't know for sure what Jesus was writing on the ground, but my view is that this links to what he's writing on the ground. You see, in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 13, it says that those who turn from the Lord will have their names written in the dust. I wonder, imagine you're there in the crowd. I'm right at the front, my stone's raised. I'm just waiting for Jesus' answer. And then he starts to stoop down and write. And I'm thinking, what's he writing? And then I read, Miles Toulmin. How does he know my name? And the stones go down. With his one answer, the tables have been turned. To throw a stone now is to say, I'm without sin. But only God is without sin. To throw a stone now is blasphemy, the penalty of which is meant to be stoning. And the crowd disperses. You see, in freeing the woman, Jesus also frees the crowd from judgmentalism. In freeing the woman, he also frees us from being the ones to judge. He changes attitudes in life. But even more than that, Jesus doesn't just change our attitudes in life, he actually saves life. He saves the woman's and he saves ours. On the cross, Jesus took the condemnation so that we, like that woman, don't have to take the hit. And he offers us that forgiveness, that grace, today, tomorrow, the day after, and forevermore. In other words, pardon the pun, but grace is only a stone's throw away for you and me. And note how Jesus offers this forgiveness before the woman has even said sorry. We're told that the crowd disperses and we're left with just Jesus and the woman. Now, what would you expect her movement to be at this point? I don't know about you, but I'd expect her to bend down at the feet of Jesus, either in repentance or in thanks. But verse 9 tells us that she still remains standing. And it's Jesus who still remains stooped at her feet. Extraordinary. And then he straightens up. He's lifted up. And he says to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you." The Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard said this: "True forgiveness is that which is offered before the offender has either apologized or sought it." And Jesus forgives us before we even realize it and before we even accept it. And in so doing, he saves our life. So Jesus changes attitudes through forgiveness. He changes lives by saving them through forgiveness. But what's more, Jesus brings freedom in life. Salvation, the word, is probably best translated as freedom. It's not just a matter of what we're saved from, it's what we're saved for. Paul puts it this way in Galatians 5. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. He set us free from condemnation. Jesus says to you and to me this morning, neither do I condemn you. And he's set us free to forgive. When we know that God forgives us, suddenly forgiving others is so much easier. When we know, and I don't just mean here that we're forgiven, but when that knowledge that we're forgiven drops to here, then suddenly a whole world of forgiveness opens up to us, and we can offer it freely to others. I bet this woman in John 8 never struggled to forgive other people again. Not forgiving, to not forgive, is to let someone rent free space in your head. But to forgive is to set someone free and find out it's you. And Jesus sets us free from destructive habits and patterns of behavior. After he's forgiven her, in verse 11, he says to the woman, "Go now and leave your life of sin." And it's no coincidence that he utters these freeing words during the Feast of Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles, when the Jewish people remembered how they were taken from lives of slavery in Egypt and moved towards the Promised Land. And if you feel trapped in patterns of behavior like a slave, then know that we are lifted and through forgiveness brought into the Promised Land. And the Promised Land is no longer a place, it's a person. It's the person of Jesus. And in him is true freedom. On the 8th of June, 1972, a napalm bomb dropped onto the village of Trang Bang during the Vietnam War. This iconic picture captured the image of a screaming 9-year-old girl called Kim, or full name Pan Thi Kim Fook. And as she ran naked, she was severely burnt. She was screaming, "Nong Kwa, too hot, too hot." They thought she'd die. But after 14 months in hospital and 17 surgical procedures, they amazingly saved her life. In 1982, aged 19, she came to faith in Jesus and immediately felt a call to study medicine. She went to university, met a Christian boy there, and they got married. Years later, in 1996, she was giving a speech in America at a US Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And she said this: "If I could speak face to face with the pilot who dropped these napalm bombs, I would tell him that we cannot change history, but we should try to do good for the present." A man in the crowd called John Plummer scribbled a note and sent it up to Kim. She opened it. It simply said, "I am that man." In shock, she moved forward in the crowd. He came forward, and the two of them embraced. He began to sob over and over again, saying, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And Kim replied, "I forgive you. I forgive you." That act of forgiveness so impacted her life that the following year she launched the Kim Fook Foundation, which provides medical and psychological assistance to child victims of war, helping them heal physically and helping them to forgive. In 2009, on a live radio broadcast entitled "The Long Road to Forgiveness," Kim said these amazing words: "Forgiveness made me free from hatred. I still have many scars on my body and severe pain most days, but my heart is cleansed. Napalm is very powerful, but faith, forgiveness, and love are much more powerful. Nothing heals like forgiveness. If that little girl in the picture can do it, ask yourself, can you?" Please may we stand.